Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of TIME100 Talks, Time's weekly live program where we bring together amazing leaders, thinkers, and activists from around the world to spotlight solutions and encourage progress. I'm Edward Felsenthal, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Time. You know, the world is facing extraordinary challenges, but we're also seeing extraordinary gestures towards others, generosity of spirit, of resources, of time. You've seen many of these people who are doing these amazing acts on this program in recent months, and we'll have more of them on today and talk about the power of philanthropy amid the COVID-19 crisis. We encourage you to participate in the program using the hashtag Time100Talks. Joining us today is U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat of Illinois. She is one of the people being considered as Joe Biden's running mate, and she'll talk today with Time Senior Editor Haley Edwards. From Lagos, Nigeria, joining us is entrepreneur, philanthropist, and chairman of the United Bank for Africa, Tony Elumelu. He'll be joined by Time contributor Kim Dozier. But first, we're going to kick things off with someone who really needs no introduction, the entrepreneur, Microsoft founder, and philanthropist Bill Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Gates has been warning for many years about a pandemic of the type we are now facing, and his foundation has been extremely active and generous with millions of dollars in contributions toward the vaccine we're all hoping to see soon. He'll discuss that and much more with Time's senior health correspondent, Alice Park. Alice?
Thanks, Edward. I'm Alice Park, National Health Correspondent for Time, and it's my pleasure to welcome Bill Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Through your work with the Gates Foundation, you have extensive experience with big global health problems. When a pandemic like COVID-19 hits, what in your mind are the priorities that government should really focus on first?
Well, every country is dealing with the incredibly negative impact, both in terms of health and their economies. And so they have to think through the right policies to stop the exponential spread of the disease. They also need to get together with other countries because until we stop the pandemic in the entire world, it's going to keep coming back. And, you know, from a humanitarian point of view, economic point of view, and just self-interest that you don't want it starting up again and again, you know, we need to pull together. The U.S. historically has led the way on things like smallpox and polio, HIV. Here, we need that kind of global response.
You mentioned the U.S. and its leading role generally when we see infectious disease outbreaks like this. This pandemic seems a little different in that respect, in that, you know, the U.S. hasn't really seemed to be taking a leading role as far as serving as a model for how to respond to the pandemic. What do you think has been responsible for that? That's something we hadn't seen before. Normally, we see the CDC out there engaging with the public on an almost daily basis. We don't see that here, and you and others have even mentioned that CDC in particular has been muzzled or sidelined during this pandemic. Why do you think that is? What do you think has contributed to that?
Well, the speed of response, you know, some countries got going much faster. Those that had been exposed to SARS or MERS were the quickest and set a very strong model. The U.S. is now starting, you know, to say, hey, the testing turnaround can't be long like this. Over half the tests are completely wasted still. You know, we need to be more prudent in not having things like bars and restaurants open. So it's a huge challenge. The CDC, I doubt many people could name anyone from the CDC. So they've been kept behind the scenes. Tony Fauci is allowed to speak in some venues, and that's good. If you score the U.S., you know, our domestic response has been weak, but can improve. Our R&D response, funding vaccines and therapeutics, has been the best in the world. And then in the third category, making those tools available to the world. We're hoping this supplemental bill, 1% of the resources would be enough to have a pretty dramatic effect and get other countries to give. So that one's incomplete still.
You talked about how for global pandemics like this, it's not just a health issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social issue, and that given the way that there is such fluid travel and porous borders around the world today, that one person's problem is really everyone's problem. That seems to be really apparent here with this COVID-19 pandemic. How do you think government leaders can sort of work better with public health leaders or people with experience like yourself and those at the Gates Foundation to better learn from the lessons, that we've learned from responding to Ebola, to HIV, to previous influenza pandemics? How do we get those government policymakers on board?
Well, it is amazing to contrast. In Ebola, the U.S. allocated money and went and helped out, even though the threat of that to the U.S. itself was very, very minor. Here, we haven't yet shown up in the international forums where the money to get these tools out to countries is being discussed. And, that still absolutely can be fixed. This went global very quickly because it's a respiratory disease. And getting the capacity to make this vaccine, we won't be able to just use market forces because we need factories owned by different companies that invent the vaccine to be used to scale up very quickly. And we don't want, even within the country, just the richest to get access to the vaccine. We want some equitable allocation within and between countries. So our foundation has a lot of the expertise that's outside the private sector on comparing the various efforts and talking about how to get high volume production going of these things. So, we're doing our best. We've given hundreds of millions to get factories in place and to have enough vaccines that at least one of them in the first or second generation will be dramatically powerful.
Let's talk about that a little more in the context of, we hear repeatedly that a problem as big as a pandemic like COVID-19, it really requires firing on all cylinders. You need the private sector as well as the public sector and even philanthropy, like you mentioned. In your view, are there things that the public sector does better, the private sector does better, and philanthropy can do or should do to make sort of responses a little more efficient and effective in the future?
Well, the private sector all by itself would simply, charge the highest price and only give to the very wealthy. And we do see that with tests where the low-income minority neighborhoods are getting the least tests and the slowest responses that makes those tests completely worthless. And there's no reimbursement. If you can give somebody a result back in 7 days, which is mind-blowing, and still get paid by the federal government the same amount. So when you use the private sector, which is where the deep expertise is, you have to use them in the right way. And that's not being done. It can't just be a pure market-driven thing. A number of the companies who make vaccines are saying they're going to do that on purely a break-even basis, which is great. Now they need to cooperate with companies that have factory capacity. They need to have tiered pricing so the poorest countries get it for the lowest price. So this has clearly got to be the public sector and philanthropy together with the private sector. Because of our history in infectious diseases and the deep expertise that we've hired, basically ex-private sector people, we're able to be a fair broker about, okay, which companies should you give advances to when they commit to build these new factories, and a lot on the therapeutics. Our trials were what showed dexamethasone is working. We're looking at a low-cost formulation of remdesivir and giving it earlier in disease. So, infectious diseases used to be, at least in rich countries, a very obscure thing. Now it's, key to getting back to normal. So we're stepping up in the best way we can.
So I'm going to go ahead and put you in charge of testing. how do we make sure that all the pieces are in place so that diagnostic testing is in place for everyone who needs it when they need it?
Well, the US has more PCR machines that do these tests per capita than any country by a large amount. And so the fact that they actually made it harder for the commercial testers to get their tests approved, they took a step backwards. They thought the public health labs could provide the capacity. Basically South Korea did it the right way. There's about 6 countries that immediately went to the private sector and said, okay, how do we get mass testing? We'll commit to buy tests. That never happened in the US. Still to this day, there's no prioritization at all of who gets tested in this country. And it's deeply inequitable and has those delays. So we should have been the strongest because of that back-end capacity. That still can be fixed. If you'd done a disease simulation like many countries had, you would realize you'd have on your checklist, item 1, call commercial providers, make commitments to them so that they run 24 hours a day and they have the test out, and only reimburse them for results that are within 24 hours.
If you were grading the US response to the pandemic, what grade would you give us?
Well, on a relative and absolute basis, not a passing grade. I will say that in terms of research, the US has funded more of this vaccine and therapeutic work than any other country. So if we complement that with some of the generosity like we've seen on a bipartisan basis for things like HIV, at least in that realm, we will potentially score the highest. But in terms of the domestic response, it still, still can be fixed. The ways that testing got back quickly in the European countries, why are we paying somebody for a delayed test? That's a waste of money. It just confuses people. But now they've delegated that to the states, but the states don't have enough power to do it. The more you know about this, the more you wish experts were taking charge.
And in your opinion, I know that you're working with the government too, with a lot of the support that you're providing for that research that you're referring to for therapeutics and vaccines. Is your voice being heard? You've got experience with both global health as well as running a multi-billion-dollar business and making all the cogs work. When you talk then about, how you're seeing things falter and seeing things that aren't getting done that should be done, can a person like yourself contribute and sort of get things moving in the right direction?
Well, certainly, yeah, because of our work on infectious diseases, we have a lot that we can provide here. And on the innovation front, even some things that we hope come through with diagnostics by the end of the year, I'm super pleased when I talk to the CEOs about, hey, we have to have, no profiteering on this stuff. That message probably is getting heard. And so, every day it's conversations about speeding up the new drugs, speeding up the vaccines, but maintaining safety. The U.S. is at the center of these innovation activities, and the government can everything it isn't doing is all there's still a chance to change course on the testing piece, the mask leadership there, and we're starting to see a little bit of movement on these things.
And with respect to that, obviously the Gates Foundation is one of the largest funders of vaccine research around the world, and so much is riding on this COVID-19 vaccine, and they're just entering the final phase 3 stages of testing now. What lessons can we apply to make sure that these trials are successful and run very efficiently to get us an answer as quickly as possible?
Well, the political pressure to move quickly is is not a perfect thing. Even calling the thing warp speed, talking about going around certain FDA guidelines. So far, the staff, the non-political staff, has held the line that we really have to prove efficacy and have the full safety database, that we're not going to go off, like we did with hydroxychloroquine and give it emergency use when there was no serious data to suggest there was anything there. It's purely political, sort of like a wives' tale type thing. We really can't do that with the vaccine. The world sees the FDA as the gold standard of regulators. So it's not just for the US, for the entire world, saying, hey, what is the efficacy in all the different groups that we're going to dose? Is there safety, depending on what other conditions you might have? And, so behind the scenes, there's a lot of, supporting that professional staff who's held the line against the pressure. And so far, so good.
Now let's talk about reopening a little bit. You've called the US reopening an ugly picture, and others completely agree with you. Have we learned anything from our sort of first wave of cases in earlier this year? And do you see any evidence that we're applying some of those lessons learned to better control this, the cases that come up with reopening?
Well, many of the initial hotspots, like New York City, the numbers are actually down pretty dramatically. And that's a good thing. And as the numbers get very low, then you can do opening up. And things like schools, particularly for young children, should be opened up. Bars and restaurants, until we have a vaccine, sadly, I just can't see the cost-benefit ratio of letting people sit in bars because there's been so much transmission that comes out of that. People talk loudly, they're near to each other. And so we haven't been as tasteful as we might like to be. Some areas of the country thought they had escaped. And so even though they had increasing cases, they opened up. Now the country's paying a price for that. And it means the reinfection back in other parts of the country, coming out of those parts of the country, will be very, very high. And so we kind of live in this together, since we're not going to stop people moving between the various states. The fall could be a challenge because people are indoors more, it's colder, and the flu symptoms will be confusing us a bit. So if we can use the next few months to get the numbers down, that will make a huge difference in terms of the deaths going into the fall.
Are you confident that we'll be able to do that, and that the fall won't be as disastrous as this summer has turned out to be?
Well, strangely, the death rate this summer has not gotten up to the peak death rate, and that's partly that we do have remdesivir, dexamethasone. We understand not to use the respirator as much, to put people on oxygen earlier. There are things the medical profession, with lots of heroes and great thinking, does to reduce the death rate. The new tools, even within 2 months, we could have some new antivirals and antibodies that could make a big difference there. So the fall is a mix for me, where the innovation track is the good news that could bring things down, and the lack of social distancing, that one hangs in the balance. We do know that all other things being equal, the fall, there will be more transmission.
When we talk about the fall, obviously everyone is very hopeful that we'll have a vaccine or some doses of the vaccine, potentially even by the end of the year. But you're familiar with what it takes to get huge numbers of doses of vaccines to people who need them around the world. The scale of what will be needed for this pandemic is really unprecedented. How confident are you that manufacturing, distribution strategies are really there to make sure everyone who needs a vaccine gets one?
Well, as yet, the US hasn't spoken up on its willingness to help the developing countries here, like the U.S. has done, and every other global health thing. I'm hopeful that the supplemental bill, like 1% of it will go to people like Gavi and Global Fund who bring us that health equity. So, that's possible. The rich countries can afford expensive vaccines, and the U.S. has made sure that manufacturing capacity is reserved for it. And so possibly as early as November, and certainly by the spring, there will be doses coming to the US. But the problem of getting to the entire world, which is 20 times as many people, that will elude us unless we're building those factories in parallel and we allocate money to that. And so that there's all this discussion. The Europeans, can't do it on their own. So they're, asking the US, where are you on this? It's, humanitarian, economic, strategic leadership. If we don't get our act together, other people will fill that vacuum. So no, it's going to be hard. If you're dosing 80% of the world, that's like 5 billion people that you want to get the vaccine out to. That's really unprecedented. Some of these constructs are very hard to scale up to large numbers. A few of them, like Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, a single factory can make a lot of doses.
So clearly manufacturing distribution are one challenge, one hurdle that we have yet to solve. There's another one, which is really the misinformation about vaccines on social media. People have already expressed reluctance about getting vaccinated with a COVID-19 vaccine because it's new and also because of existing concerns about vaccinations in general. And there's even conspiracy theories that your own company, Microsoft, is supporting the whole vaccine movement in order to implant microchips in people. How concerned are you about this type of misinformation and what role it can play in ultimately, getting a handle and controlling this pandemic?
Well, we certainly need people to be rational about vaccines. They've eradicated smallpox. They've, saved millions and millions of lives. They are very complex to design. And that's why, saying it's being done at warp speed is a little scary because you really need to do the safety checks very, very carefully. And so the conspiracy theories could stand in the way of people's willingness to take the vaccine. They could send us down a bad path. Some people counted on, bleach or hydroxychloroquine, and that's kind of tragic that various sources of misinformation misled people. We need to really, trust the experts at CDC and FDA. The world is certainly looking to those experts to help guide their response. And, so I do think the opportunity to, have people know those conspiracy theories have no basis in them. This was not a intentionally caused thing. Neither I nor anyone else is doing anything but doing our best to bring this to an end.
And obviously the key to that is trust that you mentioned, trust in the public health, trust in the science. I'm curious, you edited an issue in Time in 2018 called The Optimist. Are you optimistic about how we will manage this pandemic?
Yes, I think the U.S. response will improve. I think the innovation will come along. I think U.S. generosity will show up to help the world on this. I mean, it's a huge setback. The only good thing that'll come out of this is we'll advance some technologies that will help us be ready for a future pandemic and will help us with other diseases like malaria and HIV. But, I was one of the voices that said we should be ready for this. We weren't ready for it, and the price of that will be very high. But we will get past it, whether it's 2021, which I would hope we can get the world past it then. If not, 2022, we'll get economic growth to come back, and we'll have these platforms that will mean the next time we're faced with something like this, we'll all do as well as the smart countries did this time.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on the pandemic response and what lessons we can learn from this experience to hopefully better prepare us for the next time.
Thank you.
You're watching Time 100 Talks. I'm Haley Edwards, Senior Editor at Time, and I'm joined by U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth. Let's just jump right into the news. Your Republican colleagues in the Senate released their COVID relief plan on Monday night. Is there anything in there that surprised you?
Unfortunately not. They've really gutted any attempts at providing relief to working Americans across this country. It's really a bill that is going to give a helping hand to large corporations, and it really goes after all of the programs that are in it for working families and folks who need a helping hand. It includes a major cut to the unemployment insurance money. It includes money, for corporations, protections for corporations with liability protections, but nothing in terms of compensation for frontline workers in terms of OSHA protections, for example. And it even, provides money for mega agriculture, but no money for the SNAP program. So I unfortunately am not surprised. It's pretty depressing though to see that in the middle of a global pandemic, when so many people are hurting, that this is what they come up with.
You were tweeting about the cuts to Medicaid home and community services, which will have obviously a huge impact on people with disabilities. Can you just say a word on that?
Of course. So there's no money in the Republican proposal for, in addition to Medicaid home services, also nursing homes, which is where the pandemic is spreading. But for people with disabilities, we have fought for a very long time for the right to live our lives as independently, as productively as we want to live. And that means getting people out of institutions where it is appropriate. So most folks want to live within the community. That's why we got the ADA passed. People should not be housed and warehoused in large institutions who can live perfectly normal lives. But they need a little help. And that's where the Medicaid home health services comes in. And all of that is just left by the wayside in this bill. There's no money in it for that. And that will mean that people with disabilities, in order to live just their regular lives, will be looking at having to be re-institutionalized, which is going completely against decades of work that has been done to help people with disabilities really have their civil rights and live fully productive lives that they want to live.
So pivoting slightly to something that is dear to many people's hearts and yours as well, as the mother of 2 kids under 6, school reopenings. The Republicans' bill does include some funding for schools, which is something that you've said is necessary. Does it go far enough? And what can be done on the federal level to get kids back in school as soon as possible?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank all the educators out there, because as someone who's been trying to homeschool a 5-year-old, let me just tell you, I am not trained to do this. And like most moms, I desperately want my daughter to be able to go back and have a regular classroom experience and get the training, the teaching that she gets from a trained educator. That said, I also don't want her to contract COVID-19 and be sick. Or bring that illness home into the household, where I have a 79-year-old mom who lives with me and a 2.5-year-old baby as well. So the bill that the Republicans are proposing has some money for schools, not enough money, but that money is tied to you must reopen schools and bring students back. But there's no guidelines from this administration on how to do that safely. The Department of Education has not put out any guidelines to schools on how they should open. They have not provided any additional dollars for PPP, additional equipment. They have not provided any additional dollars for keeping our schools clean, or even for testing of teachers and all of the workers in the school, and also of students. So basically it's saying, here's a global pandemic. If you want a little bit of money, you have to reopen schools and put all of your teachers and all of the students out there with no protection. I'm not comfortable sending my daughter into a pandemic unprotected, and I don't think most other moms would be either. So this proposal from the Republicans is woefully inadequate.
So just to return to a little aside there, I think some people might be surprised that a sitting senator is actually homeschooling her own daughter right now. How is that going?
Well, 4 months ago, almost 5 months ago, when this started, I had wonderful plans. I set aside every morning, so we would do 4 hours of instruction together. And I was going to do baking with her, to do math, so she would have to measure and count. And then I had I converted my entire dining room, and over here was an art corner with like artist supplies, and over here was going to be a math corner, and we're going to do math here, and we're going to do. And then I got posters I put all over the walls with the alphabet. We're going to do basic phonics. At this point, 5 months later, it's like, here, kiddo, 5 worksheets. You get those done. You're done. It's so difficult. It's so difficult, and it is humbling. You know, I have a PhD, and I'm a U.S. Senator, and I can fly helicopters, but I am not trained or equipped to teach a single 5-year-old. And so I have nothing but admiration for educators who do this voluntarily on a regular basis. God bless our teachers out there, and they need all the support that they can get to do the very difficult job that they're doing. And I see where I'm failing my daughter, and you know, the mom guilt kicks in. The mom guilt kicks in because I see like, oh my gosh, she's not reading as well as she was when she was in the classroom and she was on track, and now, you know, she doesn't know what the difference between the p sound and the b sound, between a p and a b, and it's my fault. I'm the one that's letting her down, and she's going to be behind the other kids when school comes back to normal. You know, all that mom guilt piles on top of everything. So it's hard for working families out there.
Maybe we can relate to that a little better than you being a decorated combat veteran, which many of us have less experience with. But in that role as a combat veteran, you've taken a particular interest in the news from earlier this summer about Russia paying bounties for U.S. troops killed in Afghanistan. How do you make sense of President Trump's sort of avoidance of that issue, apparent refusal to address Russia on it?
Well, unfortunately, it reinforces the fact that he is a failed commander-in-chief. He's the commander-in-chief of our military, and he's failed in his duties as commander-in-chief time and again. He's politicized the military, and now we find out that he was being briefed that the Russians had, an adversary had placed bounties on American troops' heads in Afghanistan, and either didn't pay attention to his briefing and doesn't remember, which in itself is a dereliction of duty, or sort of thought it wasn't important to do anything about it. But regardless, he's done nothing about it. And it's been weeks and months since the story broke that this has happened, and he still has done nothing about it. He's not talked about it with Vladimir Putin. He's not come to the Senate and asked for help with additional sanctions against the Russians. He's done nothing about it but deny, and claims that he did not know that this was happening. He hasn't even called a Gold Star family. You know, I was talking to a Gold Star mom who lost her son a year ago at the end of this month in Afghanistan, and she was crying on the phone saying, I want to know if he was killed for a bounty. When I asked the Department of the Army if they've conducted any investigations into whether any of the troops' deaths and injuries in Afghanistan in the past year have been connected to Russian bounties, the answer was no. They haven't even bothered to begin an investigation. This is dereliction of duty on the part of the commander-in-chief. Our troops deserve to know that their leadership stands beside them and have their back when we send them into harm's way. And unfortunately, that's not the message that President Trump is sending right now.
We are, of course, living in a moment of extraordinary social upheaval. You have obviously been in the center of that debate lately, and you've staked out a unique position. You say you personally oppose pulling down Washington statue, say, but you support people's right to demand its removal. Can you talk about how that works in this sort of highly politicized world. How do we walk that line? How do we have the national debate?
Well, I spent 23 years in the Army defending people's First Amendment rights. I defended the Constitution. My oath of office that I've been taking since in my early 20s was to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so I fully am today, to this day, willing to die to protect a person's right to peacefully protest and to peacefully state their opinions, especially to their leaders in government and especially to their public servants such as myself. And so I think it's very consistent with where I've been and the founding of our nation. After all, it was a bunch of protesters who threw tea into Boston Harbor as a form of protest against unjust treatment by a monarch. And so I have always supported people's rights to freedom of speech. I think that we should remove all Confederate statues and rename Confederate bases, our bases are named for Confederates, because they are traitors to the Union. These are people who took up arms against our nation. As for our founding fathers, look, of course I don't want to pull down George Washington's statue, but I do defend everybody's rights to speak their mind. But let's be clear what's happening here. President Trump and his allies are trying to divert Americans' attentions away from their failures. The fact that we are now approaching 150,000 dead Americans from this pandemic, which he said would magically disappear by April. His words, would magically disappear. The fact that he's done nothing about the bounties on troops' heads in Afghanistan, the fact that he's done nothing but hurt our agricultural sector, for example, with his trade wars, the fact that he's done nothing to address issues of racism in our criminal justice system. This is all a diversion on his part away from all of his failures as president. And we cannot let him succeed at that, because this country is hurting right now. Americans are hurting. Families don't know how they're going to pay their mortgage, how they're going to pay their rent. Moms and dads don't know how they're going to feed their kids if there's no school lunch available. People are hurting and they need a leader.
So you think this debate over Confederate monuments is President Trump and his allies deliberately stoking a culture war?
Very much so, very much so. This president, time and again, when his failings become apparent, what he does is he blows his racism dog whistle, except that it's no longer a dog whistle, and he stokes up partisan divides in this country at a time when we should be coming together as a nation. We need someone that's going to pull us together as a nation and bound our wounds, which is what I believe we should be doing instead of trying to divide us.
On that, I mean, your politics and your are interesting. I mean, you're often described as center left or center moderate, and there are such a thing as a Trump Duckworth voter. Many of the
Yes.
people who voted for you also voted for President Trump. You've demonstrated that you have an appeal in the rural Midwest, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you are on a short list of people Joe Biden is considering for vice president. How do you reconcile your criticism of Donald Trump, your sort of very outspoken criticism of his leadership and his dereliction of duties, as you put it, and the fact that many of your supporters support him? How do you walk that line?
Well, it's not a line to walk. It's talking to people where they live and addressing the issues that they're facing. The people who vote for me know that I am going to go up to bat for them every single day to help them be able to do things like pay their mortgage and get their kids through college and get to retirement and have health care. That's really what most Americans are struggling with right now. And yes, there are Trump Duckworth voters in Illinois. It's about 6%. But the important part about that is that I listen, that they let me through the door and I listen to them. When I talk to a coal miner, he says to me, I feel like this country has just thrown me aside. After we grew in the 60s and 70s based on the energy I provided by digging a hole in the ground to provide the coal, you are now just leaving me behind. All I want to do is make it to retirement and make sure my kid gets through college and has a future. So it's by listening to one another and finding common ground that we can move forward. And so there's no line for me to walk. It's about being human and approaching every conversation I have assuming that the person I'm talking to loves this country as much as I love this country. And if you do that and you love this America as much as I do, we can compromise and we can move forward together. But really, it's about acknowledging and recognizing the human condition and understanding that we all have pretty much a lot of the same instincts, which is we want to take care of our families. We want to be able to be independent. And you know, we want to serve this country when we can. And, you know, that's really where the Midwest is. And I think that's where most Americans are.
About the potential VP pick, of course, you know, this is out of your hands. Biden's team will make that decision at some point on their own. But what do you think the most important characteristic of a vice president in this topsy-turvy election cycle during an unprecedented pandemic is? What do you think that is?
Well, I think what the country needs right now is a real team that can step forward and deal with the multiple crises that the next administration is going to have to deal with, not just on, you know, the inauguration day in January, but on November 4th, the day after the election. Remember that the next administration is going to have to deal with COVID-19, a resurgence of this global pandemic. We don't have enough testing. Americans are dying. Our nursing homes are becoming and have been a place where so many Americans are losing their lives, both as patients and workers. We have an economy that is in free fall, that's not going to recover unless we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a real issue here in this country with racism that exists in our criminal justice system, and we need to reform police functions in this country. And then we have a global crisis of lack of leadership from the United States in whether it's a World Trade Organization, whether it is a Paris Accord, or whether it's you know, in NATO with defense agreements. So what Joe Biden is going to need is a whole team around him, not just a vice president, but an entire team that is going to be able to address these multiple crises. I think of it as, from a military term, you know, it's the commander is going to need a great XO who can step up and do the job when the commander is not in the area of operation. But he needs that entire staff to be working, you know, at maximum capacity even before they come in and take over, because the country is in crisis on multiple fronts. And I really believe that Joe Biden is going to put together the very best team in every position. Mixing my metaphors between the military and sports, but you know, he's going to put the right team together in every position to deal with these multiple crises, because he knows how to do this, and he's going to find all the right people to do this in every position. And that's why I'm Team Biden all the way.
Well, I don't want to ask you to speculate about a, you know, hypothetical here, but I do want to raise that if you were the VP pick, you would be the first Asian American woman on a major party ticket. How significant is that?
Well, this president has been really attacking Asian Americans. He's been using Asian Americans as scapegoats, right? He keeps calling this global pandemic as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus or the Kung flu, all of these racist terms that he's using in order to stoke up his base, to distract people from the fact that he did nothing about it. And that back in February, he was actually saying wonderful things about the communist leader of China, about how well they were doing and how this pandemic was just going to disappear. When the reality is, you know, this pandemic, for the most part, most of it came to the US out of Italy. And so it is very significant for me to be on a national stage for other Asian Americans, because we often are the forgotten minority in this country. We're seen as the other, as you saw with the attacks on me by Tucker Carlson. You know, it's easy to talk about Asians as the other, and that we're not truly Americans when we're just as American as anyone else, and love this country as much as anyone else. And so, you know, I do recognize my place on the national stage, and I'm very proud to represent Asian Americans, but I'm also very proud to represent people with disability and working moms and veterans and you know, all of the great diversity that makes this country truly, truly unique and powerful in the world.
From a political standpoint, do you think it would make it more difficult for Trump and Vice President Pence to attack you as a woman of color, woman with a disability, a decorated combat veteran, a working mom? You've sort of made a name for yourself clapping back in the last couple weeks. So how does that work politically?
You know, ever since I started running for office, I've been attacked The Republican playbook is to attack your opponent's greatest strengths. It's a Karl Rove play, and frankly, it's never worked. It's never worked. The last person who attacked my patriotism, I beat by 14 points. So really, frankly, we need to talk about what this country needs right now. I mean, I say that, I don't mean to be flippant. We can sort of put forward all the bravado that we want, but at the end of the day, America's hurting, and we need to come together. And we need real leadership in this country to pull us together and to overcome the many crises. The good news is that we can do it. We're a great nation of really amazing people. And when we come together, we can accomplish anything.
So Senator, I know we're short on time here. I wanted to just get one last question in. In light of the protests, President Trump said that he is sending federal forces to Chicago, to your state. And I was wondering what is your position on federal forces in Illinois?
If federal law enforcement officials are coming to Illinois to work with local officials to provide additional resources, then I welcome them. But the abuse of power that we saw in Portland, that could happen anywhere. It should worry every single one of us. And that's what we saw. And it's a continuation of the politicization of federal government that's being carried out by President Trump, whether it was with the National Guard being ordered to suppress peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square, or whether it is what's happening in Portland. That's why, you see veterans standing up to protect and defend people who are peacefully protesting against injustice. It shows that the best of America will not be scared off by bullies. If President Trump really wants to help with issues of gun violence in Chicago, he can call Mitch McConnell right now and ask for a vote on universal background checks. He could call Mitch McConnell right now and ask for a vote to ban magazines greater than 30 rounds. He can call Mitch McConnell right now to increase penalties for straw purchasers. These are people who buy guns for other folks who are not legally able to buy guns. There are many things that we could pass right now if we would be allowed to call them up for a vote. 95% of Americans, for example, truly support universal background checks. If he wants to deal with gun violence, call Mitch McConnell. And if they want to come to Chicago and work with local law enforcement and be supportive of our city, then they're welcome. But I am not going to stand by. I am not going to stand by and let this president politicize our government and to use our government against people who are peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. Not on my watch.
Senator Duckworth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You're watching Time 100 Talks. I'm Edward Felsenthal, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Time. Up next, we have international entrepreneur and philanthropist Tony Elumelu, who will be joined by Time contributor Kim Dozier. They'll discuss how his foundation is working with entrepreneurs amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Kim?
Thank you, Edward. Welcome to Time 100 Talks. We're joined now by Tony Elumelu from Lagos, Nigeria. He is the group chairman of the United Bank for Africa. Welcome, sir.
Good to be with you, Kim.
You are a billionaire who has pledged $100 million to create 1 million jobs on the African continent. Yet here comes COVID. The African Development Bank has said the African continent is sure to go into a recession. You already had half of the continent near food insecurity levels that are dire. And your own CEO of your foundation predicts that another 23 million will be joining the ranks of extreme poverty. You have a locust swarm in East Africa that's sure to have a knock-on effect in food insecurity. And yet, you just made a multi-million-dollar investment in the bank you chair. Isn't that a pretty big bet at a dire time?
I think there's no better time to make that bet than the time we live in. You know, what the world needs today, and Africans in particular, is hope. And that, to me, is what will make the difference. But that hope has to be backed by tangibility, some substance, so that we can make it work. I was born and bred in Africa. I have seen poverty firsthand, and I know what this kind of economic hope and opportunity can do in catalyzing entrepreneurship and helping across Africa and helping to address extreme poverty that we have. Creating economic opportunity through what we do at the Tony Elumelu Foundation, through the endowment you spoke about, the $100 million endowment, is our own way of making sure that we keep the hope alive and we're able to create jobs that will help to eliminate poverty on the continent.
Yet for businesses to succeed, especially for entrepreneurs to succeed, they need investment capital. And this is a time when a lot of countries are already turning inward. Aid is going to be in even shorter supply. How are you going to lure that investment capital?
You know, for us, what we do and what we believe is that capital is important, but more importantly, there are other things that you need to do. We have seen firsthand, working through the Tony Elumelu Foundation, through the endowment we have put in place, working across the 54 African countries and trying to catalyze entrepreneurship, that training is important as capital, that mentorship is important as capital, that creating, as we have done at the foundation, a digital platform that brings all of these budding African entrepreneurs together, creating a virtual marketplace for them, which was even done before the COVID pandemic, tells us that working together with all key sectors, private sector, government sector, development partners, like the African Development Bank you spoke about, we can indeed make a difference. And the time we live in today calls for that.
Let's talk about the foundation and its work. You were well on your way, about 6 years into a decade-long project to create 10,000 entrepreneurs. And I think you were around 9,000 at last count. How are you helping them keep their jobs, keep their businesses afloat?
We live in very interesting times. The pandemic is huge, especially on our continent, and most importantly, on these African entrepreneurs. But what we're trying to do at this point in time through the work of the CEO of the foundation and his team at the Tony Elumelu Foundation is to create hope, encourage them, tell them that tough times don't last. I mean, you're talking to a man who has seen this kind of thing in the past, not of this magnitude, but I was born in northern part of Nigeria, a place called Jos. My parents lived there. They were comfortable. And then we had a civil war, which is at the time to this pandemic that we're talking about today. We left there and left everything that they ever built and accumulated there. But today, life is different. The difference is resilience. The difference is having economic hope. The difference is always thinking positive and knowing that tomorrow will be better than today. And that is what through the Tony Elumelu Foundation we're doing right now. We're talking to these young Africans, telling them, don't let your economic aspirations die with COVID. Hang in there. So we are now, through the platform we created before, the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we'll call TF Connect platform, which connects all these African entrepreneurs. We're able virtually to engage them on a day-to-day basis, get resource speakers from all over the world and ourselves to talk to them, to let them know how to manage difficult moments like that. And this, by the way, what we go through in business almost every time, just that this one is of a different proportion and dimension.
So your CEO had said that she expected COVID to hit small and medium businesses across Africa the hardest. I mean, hope is a great thing to have, but are you warning these entrepreneurs that they might have to close and mothball those businesses and then try to reopen them at a better time?
No. What we're saying is necessity is the mother of invention. We need to innovate. We need to keep thinking. Prior to this time, if you wanted to interview me, would have thought that the best way to do it is to sit down together. You are in the US or in the UK, I'm here in Lagos, Nigeria, and we're having this conversation. So we're preaching to them the possibilities, that possibilities exist, and let them keep thinking of how to improve on whatever business idea they have.
Your long-term plan was to create 1 million jobs in 10 years. You were 6 years into the project. Before COVID, how many jobs do you think you created, and how many of those jobs might be at risk right now?
From the survey that my team administered and they keep administering, the beneficiaries have almost like double. Not all of them are succeeding, but we have in terms of at least 72% of our beneficiaries, and it's not 6,000, now we have about 9,500 hanging in there, expanding their business. By the way, you know the story of SMEs and non-SMEs, most of them die after year one. But we're seeing a different trend. We're seeing beneficiaries of our program in different countries, even on this pandemic in South Africa, in Senegal, in other parts of Africa, Cape Verde and co. They all involve one way or the other now in creating the PEP that they need to drive this. So we're seeing contribution jobs that the 1 million job we set out to achieve, because given our background, we realize that it's not just enough to say we want to catalyze entrepreneurship. We need to measure what we're doing. Hence, we put certain criteria, the number of jobs, the revenue in turnover of businesses we catalyze. We are happy to see on the revenue side that they are growing. The last report I saw on the sample, I think they sampled about 200, and we saw like $72 million in annual revenue. That's impressive.
How do you think COVID is going to impact business across Africa? How is it going to change the way people do business?
I am the chairman of United Bank for Africa, UBA Group. UBA operates in 20 African countries with over 1,000 branches across Africa and serving over 20 million people. In the past, it was a problem for me, for instance, to have a meeting with all bank directors or chairmen. But just on Friday, we had a seminar with all directors of the bank through the virtual network. And it was very seamless, very useful, and everyone participated fully. We are seeing that happen. In my business now, in the banking business, digital transformation orchestrated or heightened further by COVID is a new way. Right now, you have less than 15% of our over 20 million bank customers across Africa transacting in the bank. Most of them transact online, which is over 85% of 20 million customers. That's significant. Before COVID, it was about 65%. So it's over 88% now. So that is significant. United Bank of Africa has seen an explosion in its digital platform. Thankfully, the bank invested significantly prior to this time, and now they're even investing more so that they can serve customers better.
And the more Africans get online, do you think that means more opportunities to rescue some of these businesses down the line?
What we just need to do is to make sure that digital connectivity, to make sure that the bandwidth, the telecom infrastructure that will support the explosion that we're seeing, and the new digital natives that we're having across Africa is encouraged. You know, the time has come. And I believe, you know, in the past, people used to say Africa demographic dividend of our population is, I think the time has now come to reap that demography, that dividend of our demography. And I think we need to begin. This is what I say to my friends from across the world when I engage with them. Even this morning we had conversation that we need to begin to think of life post-COVID. And today, begin to build the right foundation that enable us to reap the enormous benefit opportunity I think is about to happen. The truth is, Africa is a continent of opportunity, but we've had challenges. I will continue to say have challenges. But private sector must play a leading role in changing this. And in doing that, we need government to support it. We also need Friends of Africa to support it. You know, my wife and I were discussing yesterday. She is a Gavi ambassador for Africa. And she was just telling me about the progress that we've made in polio, because she preaches immunization across the continent. And she was just telling me about the progress that has been made in Africa, the Polio Gate Foundation, and co. That is a kind of collaboration we want to see in the 21st century, all working together to help, whether in the area of health sector or entrepreneurship, working together to help Africa move to the next level. And I believe, using this platform to say that Africa is ripe, and the young Africans are energetic, they're restless, they're ambitious, they're sure they want to succeed. And the Elumelu Foundation, we want to continue to support them, and we need everyone to go into so we can do more for this.
If I can ask you one question about an extra job I saw that you took on, some way that COVID changed your life. You put a photo on Instagram with one of your sons. Can you tell us about that?
You know, Kim, you got me there. So, you know, COVID has changed lives and what we do. My wife has become a one-woman hairdressing salon operator. She made the girls' hair. So I have now learned how to barb to cut the boys' hair. So I now do it at time. Yesterday I did it again in the evening.
So she's braiding your daughter's hair and you are handling the haircuts of the boys? How's it going? Any mistakes so far? Have they forgiven you?
Well, the boy, I didn't cut his skin, but I gave him an interesting hairstyle. So for that, the first time we were changing. But you know, that tells you the good thing about COVID. There's also a good thing, by the way, about COVID. That is helping families stay together and also creating platforms. So some of these expertise that we didn't know existed in us before. But yeah, it's quite interesting. You got me there.
Well, my last question to you, you've been generous with your time. So my last question is, Africa is going to need a lot of foreign investment to recover from the pandemic. What is your pitch to businessmen worldwide? Why should they invest there?
Now, Africa is a land of opportunity, as I said before. Challenges exist in Africa, but so do we also have huge returns on investment. Most people don't know about opportunities in Africa. Most people see the other side of the cup. What I say to my friend, I do this every time I interact with my friends, is this is the time to invest. The population is huge, it's a young population. There's today macroeconomic stability than ever before, and there's a willingness genuine willingness and realization by African leaders, especially the public sector leaders, that capital goes to where it's welcome. And so they are trying now to create the enabling environment, their markets, their countries, to attract this foreign investment. So time to come to Africa is now, and the kind of returns you make in Africa is huge.
Thank you, Mr. Elumelu. We wish you and your family health, and we appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tony, for being with us, and thank you, Kim, and thanks to all of the guests on today's program for these important discussions. We hope you'll join us next week as we have a new episode of Time 100 Talks. In the meantime, you can follow Time on social media. We hope you'll use the hashtag Time 100 Talks. We would encourage you as well, if you haven't already, to subscribe to Time at time.com/subscribe. And if you want more information on today's program, past Time 100 Talks, or future Time 100 Talks, just go to time.com/time100talks. Until then, thanks for being with us. See you next week.